My name is Chris Smithy. I've got strategic alliances for Landcope. What we're going to do today is run through the breach report from Verizon that was published earlier on this year. And to set this up, I'm going to probably talk just a little bit about StealthWatch as a product and what it does, and then we're going to run through some specific cases for how that's applicable to items included within the breach report. So for those of you that maybe are less familiar with the breach report itself, Verizon's breach report is really a case study of many case studies that have been provided by various vendors out there in the, all sorts of spaces, anywhere from public sector to retail to healthcare. So it's an aggregation of various types of reports and information that have been provided to Verizon for research purposes in building this report. One of the things that we learn is kind of a big talking point within the scope of the report itself is that we have some problems with respect to being able to identify the threats. So this particular graph that we see here, this top line, shows the number of compromises where some amount of information was compromised within a very short period of time. Down here toward the bottom, we have the amount of cases that were discovered within a similar time context. So what we can see here is that there's a pretty big delta between these 2 points, right? More than 60% of the incidents across the board, all the way from 2004 to now 2014, or I guess now 2015, but 2014 when the report was driven, are associated with things that aren't identified when the records are actually compromised. We see all sorts of reports from other institutes with respect to what that trail time is in terms of how long it takes for an event to be identified post-mortem, but I'm not going to cover that in too much detail here. What we really want to take away from this particular slide is simply that there's a big delta between how many of the events are compromising data within a short period of time and how many instances we can actually detect during that same time window. So what is the issue that we're facing here? Right? Why are we experiencing this problem where we're unable to detect more of these attacks? One of the issues here is that fundamentally we've just seen lots of changes in the way that we interact with our networks. At one point in time, network data went through a common path, right? This is whenever we had a really, really strong story with respect to perimeter controls, right? And here I've got this illustrated with a firewall, but I'm not attempting to dismiss the technology. This could be firewall, this could be IPS, this could be proxies, and all of these things are good mechanisms to deploy inside of your environment. But they were much more effective for our environments when all of the data from inside of our network and our assets that people are using had to traverse those devices and could be inspected. We don't really live in that world anymore. We live in mobile computing, and now we even live in BYOD. The biggest difference from this is that now we have devices that move outside of the perimeter. They come back in, and then they communicate with their peers. Oftentimes, these types of communications happen outside of the purview of the systems that we've put in place to control and restrict access. All of our packet inspectors, it's more difficult for them to be able to see what's going on. We also face a change in terms of the way that we are being attacked, right? So it used to be that whenever we saw transactional data moving around inside of environments, it was very noisy. So for the potential for it to scrub up against our packet inspectors was very high. What I'm talking about here is the modification from things like worms, where we had rapid spread to try to infect as many devices as possible, into some of the more modern attacks that are willing to take a longer period of time to accomplish their goals and map out our networks. So the answer that we really have here, that part of what we're going to talk about as we run through some of the use cases detailed in the Verizon report, have to do with using telemetry from the network itself as the building blocks for analysis. And when we're talking about telemetry here, one of the predominant versions of this happens to be NetFlow or IPFix information. It's a ubiquitous form of telemetry. It's available all the way down from the access layer switching all the way up to the routers that are at the edge of your network connecting you to the internet resources. Types of information that are provided by this particular type of telemetry, we see who's talking to who, we understand how long those particular transactions occurred for, it started at this time, it ended at that time, how many packets and bytes are associated with that particular transaction, and then we can even provide an accounting of how that particular transaction moved through your network, because we're observing it not just at a singular location, but we see it all the way across its path. We see it from the access layer, we see it in the distribution, we see it at the core, and then we even see it going across your devices like your firewalls, and then eventually up to your edge routing. So we have a full accounting of what goes on. And that full accounting is interesting, but we have to start to do more things with it, right? So we're seeing it from all of these places across the network. What exactly do you do with that information once it's there? Well, from a first and foremost, you've got to be able to consume it. You've got to be able to store that data and monitor it so that you know what's going on. Naturally speaking, that gives you a forensic trail of information. That's your audit log of who communicated to who and how it happened, right? So think about all of the forensic use cases that get applied to this as we move through that particular piece. Then we move on to detection and analyzing of information, right? So as you can imagine, tools like ourselves are going to take a look at this information, and then we're going to apply analytics, whether those are policy-driven types of events. Just as for instance, I don't want to see my PCI servers communicating to the internet. That would be bad. Or perhaps behaviorally driven events, where we're looking at what types of activities we expect from hosts, and then alerting whenever deviations from those occurrences are happening. And then finally, we've got the response actions, right? So response actions can take a few different forms. One is that the repository of information itself is highly useful for incident response teams to be able to go back in and understand what occurred, but we also have the potential to be able to send actions back into the infrastructure. Maybe I want to send a null zero or something of that nature to my firewall to block traffic from this particular resource, or perhaps I want to communicate with a resource like Cisco ICE to be able to go back in and quarantine devices so that they can't communicate as freely to the network, but still have basic connectivity. Some of the things that we're talking about here in terms of this detection and response can be viewed in this slide. So a whole slew of data inputs, right, all the way from potentially gathering information directly from the endpoints or the access layer devices up through the infrastructure. Our firewalls and proxies are sending us all of this information that gets correlated and synthesized into a singular view of how those systems are communicating with each other. To that, we then add things like contextual information from other sources. Maybe that's identity information about those IP addresses in question, or in the case of external hosts, it's things like threat context. Are these people a part of a known bad community out there on the internet? These definitely feed into things like our policy engine, which allow for us to create some binary types of decisions, as I had mentioned earlier with those PCI scopes. But also in terms of behavior, for where we're building up statistical profiles of activity. This device appears to be doing something malicious because he's X amount greater than what would normally be provided. All of that is then distilled into an alarming context and then provided out for the operators, whether that's looking at incidents that are being set up within the interface itself, or if they are receiving email notifications or forwarding events up to an upstream event manager. As I mentioned before, the secondary component of this is the response component, right? So being able to understand what occurred once an incident has been uncovered becomes excellent opportunity for the operators themselves, right? If we see a device that appears to have been compromised, he's communicating to a command and control location out there on the internet, we want to know all of the other surrounding information that becomes important once that compromise has been identified. Who is he communicating to inside of the organization? Has he accessed critical assets? Who's the user that's associated with that? Of those critical assets, how much information was gathered from that particular resource? All of these types of things run down into an eventuality of, do I have to issue some sort of statement as a result of said breach? So, at the end of this, the security algorithms that are put in place are really there to be able to bring data to the forefront, to tell you what types of things you're supposed to be looking at. Aside from that algorithmic view of what's going on, You're going to use the resource in terms of this rich telemetry set to be able to investigate, do your postmortems, and do your event prioritization to understand how concerned you are about this particular type of activity. Maybe one final comment there is that from that incident response type of workflow, that could be something that's sourced from a behavioral event inside of the system, or it could be an event that is sourced from somewhere outside, right? Another system may have triggered the notification, but being able to look back into the network activity is valuable all the same. So now we're going to move back into some of the specific examples inside of the data breach report and talk about what's going on from that perspective. So if we look at the incident classification patterns described within the report, the top 4 components here account for almost 90% of the incidents, and all of these can be attributed to effectively users within the network, whether that is poor usage, whether that is credential abuse, whether that's compromised credentials. They're all very common issues that are associated with our users. This is one of the biggest takeaways that we probably can have from the report is that education for our users is continually important. We will never make our users perfect, but it's something that we need to strive for from an organizational perspective to be able to improve our overall security posture. They need to understand that their actions have consequence to the organization itself. Now, we can pivot away from overall activity reports in terms of security incidents into the ones that were actually attributed to breach. So the difference here is that first segment was talking about the security incidents themselves, right? The activities that were identified where people were compromising the assets inside of the organization itself. This secondary report has to do with information was actually compromised after that particular asset was compromised, right? So people had access to information inside of the organization beyond simple controls of those particular infrastructure components. So this is a little bit different in terms of what the top 4 are, and this is going to be what we'll focus on for the following slides. We're really going to talk through point-of-sale intrusions. We're going to talk a bit about Crimeware. We're going to talk a bit about cyber espionage, and we'll talk about insider misuse and how these types of activities can be identified with components of StealthWatch. And again, here, what we're basing this type of identification off of is flow telemetry. So this is something that you have access to inside of your organization today. You simply need an analytics platform like StealthWatch to be able to make use of the information and bring this type of detection to the forefront. So point-of-sale intrusions. This was 28% of all of the confirmed data breaches inside of 2014 as reported by Verizon within their breach report. Affected industries, accommodation, entertainment, retail industries. I'm sure you guys remember a lot of the high-profile organizations that were reported, put into the news last year for some of these breaches. Some of the larger breaches, well, most of the larger breaches really do involve multi-step attacks. So that's another thing to consider here, right? It's not necessarily something where somebody goes in and immediately gathers the information that they were interested in. Typically speaking, this involves compromise of one asset within the organization and then moving internally to be able to gather the data that they're really interested in when we're talking about the larger entities. One other comment that I will make here, I don't spell it out too terribly much in the slides, but as you read the report, you'll see that point-of-sale intrusions are not just a problem for the largest of the large. These really happened across the scope of size of industry last year. So small retail organizations were affected nearly to the same degree that large ones were. The size of the breach was different because of the amount of customers that they dealt with. So what exactly can we talk to in terms of detection mechanisms that are available from flow analysis or telemetry analysis with StealthWatch against your infrastructure? From a high-level perspective, when we're talking about things like point-of-sale terminals, we're talking about credit card data and customer information. So that data has to leave the network in some fashion or another. Within StealthWatch, there's actually 2 different mechanisms that we can look at this data with. One of those is suspect data hoarding, the other is suspect data loss. So when we talk about this type of detection, suspect data hoarding is a matter of identifying the assets that are of a critical nature inside of your organization, right? Where are your data stores? And then that allows us to trend uniquely on the communication patterns of hosts outside of that community into the community to understand what's normative for interaction between those devices. This allows us to create early warning signs whenever someone starts to pull down more information than would be normal for their profile, and that may be very small numbers or could be large numbers depending upon what the asset is, but in almost every instance there is a delta between norm and the amount that was pulled down associated with the breach itself. Ideally, someone acts upon that type of information during that early phase of detection, but if that does not occur, we do have a suspect data loss alarm associated with this as well. What that's doing is trending the information patterns from the hosts inside of the network to external entities, right? So I'm uploading more information to the internet than would be normal for types of transactions that would be associated with potential loss activity. Now, I mentioned earlier as well, one of the things that we have to talk to here if you're a larger retailer is that these attacks are multi-stage, meaning that more than one asset ends up becoming compromised or is associated with an attack, or more than one action is taken in order to get to the interesting information within that particular account. The upside from our perspective in these particular instances is that not only can we look for the data hoarding where atypical amount of data movement occurs to a site or data loss, but we also get chances to detect it early on in the process. So when we talk about multi-phase attacks, a lot of this has been observed through a number of terms over the years. We've heard attack continuum. We've heard some people coin a phrase for things like the kill chain. But think of the activities that are involved in multi-stage attacks. So we have assets that are compromised and instructions that are provided. From this perspective, we can look at it in StealthWatch terms as something like long flow or beaconing, or known command and control contact, right? So somebody's communicating out to the outside world to try to find a new instruction and figure out what they should be doing next. Secondary types of actions that occur after that are internal reconnaissance activities to try to find a host that has better access to the information of interest. So here we see alarms associated with address scanning or stealth scanning. We see ICMP port unreachables. We see talks to phantoms. Those are all alerts that would be associated with scanning and reconnaissance activities inside of the network. One of the other things that I'd like to be clear and make sure that we point out is that when we talk about reconnaissance activities inside of the network, the reason that we're not picking up on this type of action with a lot of our traditional security tools comes down to a simple visibility problem. That whole benefit of being able to turn your network into a sensor and see information all the way down to access layer devices is that these attackers are willing to be more methodical about how they communicate inside of the network. As I mentioned earlier, we're not talking about trying to spread out as fast as possible and infect a whole bunch of different machines anymore. We're really talking about being able to map the assets of interest, understand where good internal pivots happen, and as a result of this, the type of interaction is much slower in nature. Finally, associated with these types of attacks, sometimes we see things like brute force logins. This type of activity would be to be able to communicate to that system. We're going to have credentials. Where credentials weren't able to be gathered in advance, we're going to try to force a login to a system of higher privilege. So all of these things become relevant inside of the process. I would say that irrespective of credential use, you see a lot of the scanning and reconnaissance type of activity. You see those types of internal pivots, and then you still have the opportunity to, for a user, understand that things like data hoarding are occurring, where they're moving information from sensitive systems to lower sensitivity systems. So moving on from point of sale, right, let's talk a little bit about Crimeware. So Crimeware is the classification within the Verizon breach report that's talking about malware that's not associated with some other more specific type of criteria, or a more specialized classification pattern as they refer to it. Represents 18% of all of the breaches. Common activities here, we've got distributed denial of service or denial of service attacks, and then communication to command and control activity. Frequent targets here are bank records and user credentials. So in many instances, this could potentially be a subset of another type of activity as well. Crimeware as a component can be monetized for other entities. So talking about how we can detect some of the actions that take place from these Crimeware-infected systems, right? We have DDoS sources, right? So which of the devices are attacking other systems from the perspective of distributed denial of service attacks? Rate-based attacks, when looking at telemetry as a source, are actually fairly easy to detect from a high-rate perspective. So we have flood-based patterns across all the different types of protocols. We have high total traffic in terms of a very large amount of information that moves forward, potentially lots of TCP resets being received by a system is another indicator of a denial of service attack. And we actually have one that I seem to, oh no, we didn't, it's right there, slow connection flood. So slow connection flood would be the type of attack that leaves the windows themselves open for exorbitantly long periods of time, right? Instead of trying to attack the system with just a very, very large number of packets, it's increasing the overall session count that a server has to be able to maintain. So small number of packets, extending out the overall lifespan of the connection itself. Past that, we move back into some of these scanning and brute force types of alarms again. So understanding that reconnaissance activity is occurring within the organization. When we talk about being able to monetize malware within an organization, being able to map out a network is a valuable component of this particular subset of activities. And in mail, we see that mail is a common vector for attack patterns here as well. So being able to understand if certain systems start to behave atypically from perspectives of how they handle email treatment, whether to or from that particular system. So from here, let's move on to cyber espionage. Cyber espionage in a lot of instances is associated with various state-run types of activities in terms of the assumptions here, right? Top bullet point for us is associated with attribution being difficult. It's hard to nail down precisely who was associated with all of these attacks. Only a third of them have any kind of definitive attack or attribution associated with them. Still a high percentage of the attacks where breach or loss of data was actually associated with the actions, though, at 18%. So most targeted industries, according to the report, we've got manufacturing, government, information services. Social engineering is a pretty constant thread here, right? So people are looking for information to be able to crack the credential usage of operators inside of these accounts. Again, our users are one of our biggest weaknesses in these particular instances. So targeted data here, it could be that they're looking for similar types of information where they want to gather information about our users. It could be that the data that they're looking for is trade secrets so that they can produce the next widget faster. We could also have things where it's data corruption associated with these particular types of attacks, right? So rather than stealing the information, they simply want to pollute it so it's more difficult to produce. So what are we doing from a cyber espionage perspective? So monitoring of outbound traffic for suspicious connections is interesting here. How much data is moving to and from external sources? Are there an atypically large number of new transactions that are associated with this? Our index values tend to be good indicators here as well. So an index value within StealthWatch is really a roll-up value of multiples of different types of attack vectors. So if I were to look at two of the very highest level type of indexes, we have concern index and target index, and then we have a number of subsets there, but concern index would be a pointer to say this system overall is acting peculiar. He's doing bad things. And when we talk about those bad things, it's activities like we've detailed before, right? So it could be that there is scanning and reconnaissance activity that is going on. It could be that he becomes a source of denial of service attacks. We could be seeing atypical protocol usage or data hoarding from that host. All of these different types of activities build into our view of what's going on from this particular perspective about this device. The important aspect here is that the activities that are triggered by a lot of these behavioral actions in terms of inspection for what's going on within the different systems have to do with being able to build up an understanding of what normal actions look like within a particular environment so that we can alert against those changes. One of the other things that I will mention as well is that in addition to being able to build out these types of behaviors for the hosts to understand what's going on and what makes them unique, this type of visibility into an organization to understand what hosts are doing is really something that people have an idea of, but being able to understand what's truly going on is something that tools like this can facilitate for you. So in addition to being able to understand atypical behaviors, we can really help build up the appropriate types of segmentation for the network that would be needed to create security policy and create better boundaries for activities in general. Big pieces of this as well, detecting and stopping of lateral movement. So all of these same types of things that we've referred to before are applicable whenever we're talking about cyber espionage as well. We want to stop them from creeping around and uncovering what's available inside of the network in terms of asset discovery. We want to limit their ability to move over to systems that have better privilege within the network. And if we can augment this phase, we've effectively mitigated that data hoarding type of action or data loss type of action that logically follows where they start to move information out of the network. So final item that we'll talk about here, and then we can open up for some questions. Insider misuse was number 4 on our list for actions that were attributed to data breach and data compromise. So here we simply have trusted people inside of the organization that have the network access, they've got credential, they have access to our sensitive resources. It may be that we have a malicious insider, similar to a Snowden type of an event, where they believe that they are carrying forth an agenda that to them feels right, or maybe they're just disenfranchised, or it could simply be that credentials for those trusted insiders are compromised due to negligence, right? I put up sticky notes all over my desktop to say what my passwords are. I make my passwords my cat's name and my date of birth. Those types of things can lead to problems associated with insider misuse as easily as uploading information to resources that are insecure, clicking on things that they shouldn't be clicking on. So this represents a smaller number than the previous actions, but it's still over 10% of confirmed data breaches. Most of these can be attributed to end-user activity going just in a bad way. So primary motivators here are financial gain, and it's easily accessed, right? So there's a convenience factor associated with internal misuse being attributed to these actions. So how do we control this? It's very similar to the previous use cases. We need to know who has access to our data. We need to start building up profiles of what's normal for those users. From there, we can look for the activities associated with what type of access are they establishing to our trusted resources. Are they putting more information up to resources outside of the network? Are they downloading more from those particular trusted resources? What does that activity cycle look like, and is anything atypical in terms of their communication patterns? Then again, we want to look for our data loss type of activity after we've seen the suspect data movement inside of the organization. What are they doing with it? So if we see somebody that normally downloads 10 megabytes a day from our CVS servers, did they download several gigabytes after that? Are we moving this data up to Google Docs or Box.net, or hopefully not one of our competitors? And with that, we will wrap the official session. We'll go into some Q&A.